For a long time, narrative in images was considered a form of entertainment aimed primarily at an audience of children and illiterates. Artists such as William Hogarth with his Morality series and Rolf Topfer, author of Monsieur Viebois, were among the first to try and elevate this art form. The turning point was 1896, the year of publication of a particular Yellow Kid strip. For the first time in a cartoon, balloons appeared. Since that moment, the whole world realized the expressive potential of comics. In 1929, the first standalone comic book magazine was born, called The Funnies, published by Dell Publishing. Comic magazines began to spread, and in 1933, the famous Funnies was born, while in 1937, Detective Comics were launched, and in April 1938, Superman, by Shuster and Siegel, appeared on the cover of Action Comics. The superhero genre was created, and the government immediately understood that this was an incredible cultural revolution and decided to use comics as a propaganda tool. In the following decades, comics took on a more authorial style, and in 1992, the Mouse series won the Pulitzer Prize. In Italy too, this medium attracted the attention of the public. In 1908, the Corriere dei Piccoli was founded. The stories in the Corrierino included short, rhyming captions. Cartoons became a place for propaganda, and characters like Italino were created. In 1968, Hugo Pratt published the first story of Corto Maltese, A Ballad of the Salty Sea, the first graphic novel in history. The 70s were characterized by the diffusion of underground comic magazines among all Frigidaire and Linus. The evolution of German comics has been decidedly troubled. Some of the initiators of comics, such as Rudolf Dirks with his Max und Moritz, had been active in Germany since the end of the 19th century. The rise of the Nazi Party represented a setback. Very few authors were active during the period, among them E.O. Plauen, author of Vater und Sohn. The construction of the Berlin Wall created two parallel markets, the West one dominated by American imports, and the East one, where Mosaic, which is still the best-selling series in Germany, made its mark. Scott McCloud defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. The basic element of a comic is the frame, the space in which the action takes place. The rhythm of a comic story is given by the gather, that is the wet space between two vignettes. This has the function of a spatial and temporal demarcator, and its use will give well-defined meanings to the panel. Important parts of comics are obviously the color and the line, which can be simple or modulated. The letters in a vignette have the task of expressing sounds. There are the big noises, very loud sounds, captions which simulate a narrative voice, and dialogues in the balloons. Cartoonists use icons to simplify the object they want to represent, keeping only the recognizable feature, the essence. By simplifying the figure, they amplify its meaning. In fact, we empathize more with a simplified face than with a photorealistic one. This simplification is called caricature. It can be used to exaggerate the peculiarities of certain characters, to create a humorous interlude, to make a particular element recognizable, and to suggest moral characteristics. Other times, figures are rendered through caricatures to create a totally new narrative world, completely detached from the real one, as Lorenzo Mattotti often does. For expressions, comics use a theatrical language. There are expressive codes that associate certain expressions and movements with certain meanings. Spoken language, on the other hand, is simulated through deixis, fragmentation, focalization, and other discursive signals. Differently from simple illustrations, time flows in a cartoon, and to indicate this, cartoonists draw a line called lines of movement, which form a sort of streamline of the original image. The first one to talk about translation in comics was Jacobson, whose theories were later expanded by Thury and Umberto Eco. Comics fit into a certain sociocultural context, so when the translator works on a comic book text, he also has the task of filtering certain content, which may be perceived differently depending on the culture. This concept is analyzed by Yehan Zitawi in relation to Disney comics in the Arab world. He shows how such editions are adapted in different ways according to the situation represented, starting from more radical solutions such as covering female bodies in bathing suits, to adapting names of festivities. In this way, the culture and the reader's face, term created by Levinson and Gould, are respected. It is not only important to modify text and images, but also it is important to adapt the actual shape of the book in which the cartoons are printed. The Italian readership, for example, is accustomed to a Bonelliano format, with stories of about 100 pages, while the French readers are tied to the album format with its 48 pages. In some cases, it is also necessary to invert the original reading order, as in the case of tankobons of Japanese derivation. Depending on the format the editor chooses to use, the content of the comic itself can be altered, undergoing mutilation of the text or republication in black and white. The translator and adapter of a comic cannot simply limit himself or herself to transpose the text into another language, but he or she must first of all analyze what culture he or she is dealing with. He or she must know which pop references can be left unchanged and which must be explained. For this type of translation, a deep artistic sensitivity is required. Adaptation cannot be handled mechanically.